Hello everyone. Today I'll be doing something a little different from what I usually do on this channel. I'll be making a tutorial on how to make paints from the comfort of your own home. So firstly, I'll go through the materials you will need. A glass plate is important as a surface to make a paint on. Mine is a little scarred from previous misadventures, but it should work fine. So next you will need a glass molar. So these can usually be found in art shops. However, if you cannot find one, you can order online, or if budgeting does not allow, there are videos online that teach you how to make your own one at home. Now, whether you are using this setup to make paint or crush the souls of your enemies, it is important that your glass plate and the bottom of your molar are not smooth, but instead you can say frosted. Usually, glass plate and molars that you buy at art shops will have this done for you already. However, if it has not, you can place silicon carbide or effectively sandpaper between your glass plate and your molar and mold your glass plate with a molar with the silicon carbide in between, and it will create a rough texture on your glass plate and on your molar to make sure that all the particles from the pigment are easily combined with the binder. Next, you will need palette knives. Personally, I prefer to have two roughly round ones in order to mix the pigment into the binder, and an additional kind of squarish one to close off the tube at the end. You will see how this plays out when we actually start making the paint. Next, you want an aluminum tube to store your finished oil paints in so that they don't get dry. Importantly, it should be aluminum because it's more suitable for this instead of, say, magnesium or cesium or mercury. Those are not very good for your general health and safety, and hence you should probably not use tubes made of such material. So this tube is 30 milliliters, which is of a reasonable size. You can usually find these tubes. They are empty tubes on the internet at various online stores. Next, and most importantly, you need your pigment. Here I have a burgundy yellow ochre from Crema Pigments. I think Crema Pigments is a good place to source your pigments because they have many wide selection of high quality pigments. However, their price can be a bit on the steep side, so it may not be the best choice when you are just starting out. However, in general, when you're starting out, you may want to choose a cheaper pigment so you can afford to make more errors when you are trying to figure out the best combination or proportion of ingredients to use. So I would suggest natural earths like this yellow ochre, or perhaps red ochre or the siennas or the umbers, which are cheap and widely available, and they allow you to add an interesting and useful color to your palette. Other useful and interesting colors you can try is maybe ultramarine blue or other iron oxide pigments such as Mars Black or Mars Violet. But in general, pigments is a very broad and interesting topic. So I would say just play around, experiment, but don't overspend on the pigments that you can't afford. And soon after a few tries of making paints, you will discover which pigments and which type of pigments you like more. I will consider covering pigments in greater detail in a later episode for those who are interested. But for this video, for the demonstration of how to actually make the paint, I'll be using the yellow ochre. So next you need oil, considering that this is called oil paint and not, acetone paint. So what I have here is cold pressed linseed oil from Crema Pigment. Cold pressed linseed oil is different from the usual linseed oil you'll find at art shops, which is usually purified linseed oil. It's different in that it dries slower, and I find that it cooperates with the pigments better, hence it's more suitable for making oil paint. I tried making a batch with purified linseed oil, and the oil separated from the pigment very easily. So I personally would suggest using cold pressed linseed oil. However, there are also people who use alkyd, such as walnut alkyd, and due to my flamboyant and unpredictable personality, I have not tried them, so I'm unable to comment on their effectiveness. However, you can experiment with them to see if you like them. Also, there are people who use safflower oil or poppy oil, which can be used for those colors that are affected by the yellowing of the linseed oil, because linseed oil tends to yellow a lot more than, say, the poppy oil or safflower oil. For example, Winsor & Newton uses a lot of safflower oil. I'll suggest using these oils for, say, your white pigments or your light blue pigments, which will be more significantly affected by the yellowing of the oils. The proportion of pigment to oil is also very important, so you would want the ability to add your oil dropwise. Here I have a container with a dropper on it, so I can drop my oil into the pigment to better control the proportion. You can also use any normal dropper that you can find. Now, some pigments are toxic, and in general, breathing in fine powder on a regular basis is not very good for you, so using protection is important. Here I have some latex gloves, which are disposable, so they prevent any toxic pigments from coming into contact with your skin and also make cleaning up a lot easier. You can also use a respirator or mask to prevent pigment from going into your lungs and getting lung cancer. However, it might be a bit challenging to find one in the current global situation. Paint making is also a very messy process, so you may want to wear some old clothes that you don't mind getting dirty. Here's mine. It's seen better days. So firstly, you want to put on your gloves at 2 times speed because time is money, and money is good. Now you want to put your pigment on your glass plate. Be careful when you're pouring your pigment in case you pour too much. It's usually not very good to return excess pigment back into the container because contaminants and stuff, but then again, we're not in the lab, so I think it's fine. You want to make a small well in the middle of your pigment pile, almost as if you're baking something, except you probably shouldn't be eating this. Next, you want to pour some oil into the well. It's okay if it leaks out a bit, as long as you catch it before it goes off your glass plate to the abyss. And use your palette knife to just incorporate the oil into the pigment. Usually you want to start with a bit less oil and slowly add more as time continues, because you usually have more oil than pigment. So if you add too little oil, you can always add more. If you add too much oil, you may not have enough pigment to counter it. So here, as you can see, I have added too much oil because I'm good at this. So we will quickly remedy this situation by adding more pigment. So this is also why you would want to not pour down all of your pigment at once. In case you do add too much oil, then you can still add some pigment to get your paint to the right consistency. So as for what the right consistency is, it varies depending on what you like. There are people who like thicker paint, there are people who like softer paint. You know, online they say that good paint has a buttery consistency, which I think it's not a very good measure, because butter has many consistencies. It can have the consistency of a rock. It can also have the consistency of literal water. So I'd say a good consistency is, or at least my personal preference is, it's thick enough to hold its shape when you build it into some texture, but it's soft enough that you can move it around without much effort, or without using too much force. So as you can see here, I'm doing very small adjustments using the dropper to add small amounts of oil and using the palette knife to add small amounts of pigment. So here, once you get to about the right consistency, you can start molding your paint. So you just take a molar and spread your paint out on your glass plate. You can go in the figure 8 pattern. I find that's what's most efficient. As you can see, the paint likes to ride up onto the side of the molars. That's perfectly normal. You can just take a palette knife and scrape it. Another thing to note is your consistency before you start molding should be a bit thicker than your ideal consistency, because when you start molding, your paint tends to get softer as your particles get broken up. And also, if you find that while molding your paint is too thick, you can always add a few drops of oil, while it's a bit harder to add some pigment in the middle of molding. If you find that your paint has stuck to the sides of your palette knife, you can always scrape it off with your other palette knife or by scraping it against the molar, which is why it's good to have 2 palette knives. It's a very repetitive process. Once you have spread out your paint, you can look for places that have built up paint, such as on the edges of where you have spread it out, or by scraping the edges of the paint that's stuck to the side of your molar, and just spreading those out more. Don't worry, this clip is sped up. I wish my muscles had such unparalleled efficiency. Be careful of your paint going too close to the edge and falling into the gaping abyss that is the side of your glass plate, because it's a bit hard to get the paint back onto the glass plate once it has fallen off the sides. Don't hesitate to take breaks in the middle, because paint making is a really tiring process. As you can see, I'm taking regular breaks because my stamina is kind of tight. It's also perfectly okay to adjust the composition of your paint and the amount of paint that you have in the middle of making your paints. So if you find that after molding for a while, your paint has become too soft, feel free to add a bit more pigment. If you find that your paint has become too hard after some molding, just add a few drops of oil. If you take your tube and have a little comparison and see that you have not made enough paint to fill your tube, and you still have some leftover pigment, just feel free to add a bit more pigment and oil such that you have enough to fill your tube. So generally, the goal of molding your paint is to make sure that your pigment is fully incorporated into your binder, and such that your paint is smooth. So some pigments do this easier than others. For example, this yellow ochre surprisingly incorporated really well into the oil, such that after molding for about 10 minutes, it's pretty smooth already. But some other pigments may feel a bit gritty in the oil. For example, from my experience, Caput Mortuum Violet or the Mars Violet and Pozzolana Red Earth, for example, are much more gritty, and hence they need to be molded for a longer time. If you press down your molar onto your paint and you hear the sound of grit between your glass plate and your molar, it's just you need to mold it for a bit longer. It is actually interesting to note that for mineral pigments such as azurite or smalt, if you somehow manage to get your hands on those, that they lose their color if you grind them too thinly. So if you're working with those pigments, it's okay to feel a bit of grit in your paint. But personally, I've not had any experience with them because they are very expensive. But it's just worth noting that some pigments do have this property. They're usually those that are made from semi-gemstones. Usually, to be safe, you can mold your paint for a bit longer than it seems to take for it to get smooth, to really ensure that your paint is smooth. So the time it takes to fully mold paints really varies from pigment to pigment. For example, this yellow ochre, I molded for around 45 minutes to get to a desirable consistency. Some other paints, such as Vine Black, I mold for an hour and a half, but usually it's around an hour for 30 ml of paint. So just experiment around and just get a feel of when the paint becomes smooth, and that's about the time that you can stop molding. So that's all I have to say. Molding is a really repetitive and tiring process, so I'll just speed the rest of my molding footage up with some nice music so you can see my suffering and agony. Paint molding. So once you're done molding, you can put your paint into the tube. So you gather all your paint in the middle of your glass plate, and the aluminum tube is open at the back, so you can scoop your paint in that way. If your aluminum tube has like a freshener seal at the front, you can consider breaking that before you start putting the paint in, or else trying to remove that after you start putting your paint in might be a bit messy. So here you can see that I'm just scooping the paint in with my palette knife. So you can do a little at a time and just scrape the paint off your palette knife against the edge of the aluminum tube. And to get it deep into the aluminum tube, you can vigorously slam it into your glass plate. So I find that this is the most efficient method for me. And if any paint spills out, just scrape it off with a palette knife. There are some methods online which use a paper palette, for instance. I find that those methods work, but it's not as efficient as I hope, so I'll still stick with this method. Just make sure you get all the paints off your glass plate and scoop it into your tube. So you want to actually not fill your tube to the brim, because you need to close off the tube later. As you can see, even this amount is slightly overfilled, as you will see later. So just clean off the edge of your tube with a piece of tissue or wet tissue if the paint is stubborn, and just fold the end of the tube closed. So as you can see, the excess paint that you have filled into the tube will be squeezed out. Just patiently squeeze the excess paint out of the tube and leave approximately 1.5 centimeters around there of entirely flat surface at the back of your tube. So to do this, you really have to squeeze all the paint that is remaining on the tube out of the tube. This can be quite a messy process, but it's important to make sure that your tube is sealed properly. So if at any point your hands or the tube gets too messy, you can take a piece of tissue and just wipe off any excess paint. So once you have folded the end of the tube closed, just take the tissue and smoothen out the end of the tube by pressing against it. Make sure it's relatively smooth and all the excess paint has been removed, as you can see there. If it's not perfectly smooth, it's okay. It gives it the rustic feel. So now you take your squarish palette knife. You have the approximate length of the end of the tube you want, and you put it against the tube and you just fold it in, like in the video. Just make sure that the fold is nice and tight. The palette knife will help to ensure that the fold is straight. So just make sure that the fold is very tight. There will usually be some excess paint that spills out at this point. Just wipe it away with a tissue. Then next, sorry I couldn't manage to capture this on camera, but along the edge of the fold you just made, just fold it down again as if you're like rolling the tube up towards the cap. So you have like a 2-layer fold at the back. So you can just repeat this as many times as your flat surface at the end of the tube allows. Usually I do 2, and I think that's enough for proper sealing. So once you're done with that, you can take a pincer and really ensure that the fold is tight, and after that just wipe off any paint stains you have made on your tube with a wet tissue. So it will appear that I used maybe about 50 grams of pigment to make this 30 ml of paint. It really varies from pigment to pigment. So all the excess paint that you have squeezed out of your tube, you can save it later to test out your paint with, which I will show right now. So here we have the excess paint from just now. It's holding its shape pretty well and it's pretty smooth. So I'll paint this out of some Old Holland Titanium White. I like the Old Holland brand Titanium White because it's of pure pigment white 6. It doesn't have any zinc white mixed into it, so that the white paint can have its maximum strength. So over on the easel you can see some of the swatches I've done for other paints I have made. So using a small flat brush, I will paint some of the paint onto the canvas. It has a pretty nice texture, it's retaining the brush strokes pretty well. So I'm just adding a bit more white to paint it out and to see its color profile. It's a very characteristic yellow ochre color. And painting it out, the texture was very satisfactory. It mixed with the white paint pretty well. So I think this will be considered a success. So here we have the finished tube of paint. As you can see, I've made some markings on it. I have written oils on it because it's a tube of oil paint. I have written Burgundy Yellow Ochre in many languages like they always do. I think it's an interesting feature. I have also pasted the swatch that we've painted earlier onto the tube so that we can accurately see what the color on the inside is. And I've written the pigment index number, which is pigment yellow 43, onto the tube. So I cut the swatch out with a sharp knife, like this X-Acto, and pasted it on with a contact liquid. So this is a tube of Burgundy Yellow Ochre with my other paints. As you can see, this is how I usually mark my paint tubes. So that is a tube of paint from start to finish. Thank you all for watching. I hope you have enjoyed the video. If you have, please leave a like and consider subscribing. If you wish to see more videos, perhaps about how to make watercolors or comparisons of different paints, or maybe even speed arts, please do leave a comment. Thank you!